Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Now, global vaccine inequality created by pharmaceutical companies and wealthy nations have undercut Africa's ability to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. This is according to international rights group Amnesty International in its annual State of Human Rights report. The report also pointed out that the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted Africa's lack of investment in health sectors over many decades.
Notes that the world's richest countries, alongside corporate giants, contributed to global inequality, with most African countries left struggling to recover from COVID-19 due to high level of inequality, poverty and unemployment, made worse by the unequal distribution of vaccines. By the end of last year, less than 8% of the continent's 1.2 billion people had been fully vaccinated. Big pharmaceutical companies say the report made huge profits as rich and powerful countries bought more vaccines than they needed, shutting out poor countries from the market. Africa is, however, not free of blame. The report blames Africa for years of neglect of its healthcare infrastructure, and this situation was laid bare by the pandemic, with allegations of corruption in relation to COVID-19 funds undermining health sectors in many African countries. The report states that African governments took advantage of COVID-19 health protocols to additionally pretext for the repression of peaceful dissents across the region, with the first instinct of many governments to ban peaceful protests, citing health and safety concerns. Also in the focus is what the report terms as disturbing silence from the African Union Peace and Security Council following human rights violations in Ethiopia and Mozambique, where there were reports of unlawful killings, sexual violence and displacement of thousands of civilians.
Well, for more on this story, we're now joined via Zoom by Amnesty International South Africa Executive Director, Shenilla Mohamed. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Good evening, Peter, and thank you for having me.
All right, before we get into the specifics of this latest report, I'd like to try and get a sense of a trend over time in terms of the state of human rights. When you compare the state, this report, and the one a year ago, where are we? Are things better or worse generally?
Unfortunately and sadly, Peter, things are worse. Our report of 2020 was pretty damning, but I think 2021 is actually worse because what we saw was an increase of the rights violations that we had documented in 2020. So, for example, we saw, when it comes to people's right to protest and, dissent and, media freedoms, we saw that in 2021, a third of the countries in the world, and, Amnesty's report covers 187 countries, had actually introduced new legislation in order to block media freedom, in order to block dissent, in order to block protest action. I mean, we saw in Russia, we've seen a number of media companies shut down, and it's just gotten worse and worse. So it's not a good year for human rights, and the situation just seems to be getting worse.
And COVID-19 was one thing that was abused in terms of offering excuses for bad behavior in many respects. Let's start with this whole thing about the collusion between richer nations and pharma companies, and in the process, Africa getting left behind. What was going on?
Well, Peter, to go to your sort of formula, which is, is this something new? What has the trends been in the past? I mean, it's not new. Collusion between pharma companies and states has been ongoing for ages. We saw that during the AIDS pandemic in Africa, when, we struggled to get pharma companies to allow African countries or even global South countries to produce AIDS medications, and we saw a similar trend here. What we saw during COVID-19 was that first of all, the pharmaceutical companies were more in collusion with Western governments or richer governments, in that they were providing them with the vaccines that they needed, and we saw them storing vaccines, whereas only 8% of Africans at the end of 2021 were vaccinated, and actually less than 2% of the vaccines that were produced actually came out to Africa. What we saw in richer countries was not only did their people get two vaccinations, but they also got their boosters, while Africans were still struggling. And of course, that has a knock-on effect, Peter, because, the lack of vaccines, the lack of being able to control COVID when there was a vaccine available, meant that schools and education suffered. Of course, our healthcare facilities, which were already not doing very well ahead of COVID-19, almost in some countries collapsed under the burden. And most importantly, we lost people. People died as a result of this collusion. And, and for what, Peter? It was for money. And, what we found was that by the end of 2021, some of these pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, actually boasted a profit of around 54 billion, while people died, while Africans struggled to even get one of those vaccines.
One of the things that shocked me was the drop in price of the tests. And I don't understand that. I mean, that for me is also another abuse that we were seeing. I mean, it was almost racketeering the levels of the costs initially.
Absolutely. And, what we, organizations like ours, expected was that, this was a major crisis, one of the biggest crises the world has experienced since World War II. And, really what we were hoping to see was that the leaders of the world would come together and find a solution that would benefit the whole of humanity. But instead, what we saw, Peter, the same old thing, that some lives are more important than others, that inequality is widened, that people's lives, especially if they come from poorer communities, don't matter in the whole scheme of the world. And actually what this pointed to was poor leadership, but also there is something seriously wrong with the way in which the global structures operate, where profits and money really takes precedence over lives, even in the middle of a global crisis, even in the middle of a pandemic. They still did not do the right thing.
All right, so yes, the farmers of the world and the richer nations colluded, but do you also get a sense that we perhaps got let down by our own leaders? Because as you said, this is not something new. So over time, we should have known that, listen, we're being pushed out, we're being muscled out, we need to create our own capacity. You hear stories of, and I'll give you one example in Zimbabwe, where the maternity unit at their major hospital there was built in 1977, and nothing has been added since. And I find that hard to believe.
Yeah, we definitely cannot let our governments off the hook. And, while, our report does point a very solid finger at richer countries, but let's be honest, our governments did not come to the table. Our governments did not show leadership. Our governments did not put their people's health and life, the right to life, at center stage. So already they were failing. They were failing in the provision of health care. They were failing in the provision of education. Amnesty has documented this over and over again. They were failing in the provision of maternal health care. We've reported on babies dying all the time. And then along comes COVID. In South Africa and in other parts of Africa, they took forever to actually start getting the vaccines in or start, even thinking of purchasing them. So there was a huge delay in that as well. And then, of course, added to that, the Western or the richer countries' selfishness really put a spanner in the works. And again, what we saw, which was the breakdown of infrastructure, was infrastructure that was already breaking down. COVID just came and literally put a nail in that coffin. So our leaders are not great examples of leadership. And, and I think what the biggest finding of our report in 2021, that across the board, whether it was in richer countries or whether it was in poorer countries or on the African continent, leadership failed the people. And our leaders are amongst those that failed their people. And I think that, we need to hold them accountable. We can't keep on pointing fingers everywhere else when our own home needs to be sorted out. And I think that's across the continent, that we see that our leaders are just not they are not valuing their own people's lives. So, how do we expect others to do so? They are fine when people are dying in horrible conditions, when children fall into pit latrines and die, when women are being raped and brutalized. And, all we hear is rhetoric. In our report in South Africa, in the first half of 2021, 117 women were murdered through femicide. We had over 14,000 cases of sexual violence. And, none of these are getting any better. So we have a lot to blame our leaders for. And I think, that is something that in 2022, we need to be really thinking about how to hold them even more to account for their failures in leadership.
All right. So leadership failure is one thing, but they also abused their powers because of COVID-19 under the guise of COVID-19 restrictions. Actually, we saw a lot of politics playing out, suppression of voices, media, and so on and so forth. Is that something that's been consistent during the COVID-19 story?
Well, it's really, as you say, it increased during 2021 and during the COVID pandemic. In South Africa, we saw the army being sent down. Army is not trained in public order policing, and yet we saw, the army being deployed. During their deployment, people were killed. We saw this, the overuse of force by police, not only in South Africa, but across the continent. We saw that media houses and people's protest action were being silenced, and like I said earlier, we saw that new laws were being put into place, and this was all done under the guise of protecting the public. This was all done under the guise of protection from COVID-19. Now, when I say guise, definitely there was some element for the need to have some form of protection, but the state took it way too far. And used COVID to actually silence people, used COVID to actually silence dissent and protest action. And I think that this is one thing we must be very wary of as civil society, that, we don't fall back into that, a trap of allowing them to silence us. Because if there was one thing that shone through in 2021, it was the fact that people still fought despite these horrible conditions and despite facing a very, very deadly disease at one point. People continued to raise their voices. People continued to show their power. And I think that was the one flicker of hope that our report found in 2021, that across the globe, people continued to try to fight for their rights under the most horrendous situations. And when I say horrendous, it was absolutely horrendous. We saw 200 media houses, for example, shut down in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. In Belarus, Peter, the army, the government actually sent up fighter planes to bring down a civilian aircraft in order to arrest one human rights defender. So this was the absolutely ridiculous lengths to which states went in order to shut down people who were fighting for rights. And I think that, we need to be very careful as civil society that moving forward, this does not become the norm.
What are the biggest alarm bells on the continent for you in terms of deterioration of human rights?
Well, first of all, Peter, we still have too many conflicts on the continent. And, with conflict comes a whole lot of rights violations. And, our governments have not been able to resolve some of the conflicts that we see happening in Libya, in Ethiopia, in Somalia. There's just an ongoing, conflicts that should have been resolved by now. And yet we're seeing new conflicts emerging. And so that's one of the biggest alarm bells that, we need to bring an end to these conflicts, and we need to ensure that, there's a rebuilding. And in fact, this was promised, the rebuilding was promised by leaders, but we never saw any of that. It was all empty promises. And of course, the healthcare and health facilities, we need to rebuild our infrastructure. We need to make sure that it's fit for purpose. We need to make sure that, we are, a lot of the infrastructure that you see in Africa, as you said in Zimbabwe, was built for a minority group of people, and our states have not expanded that for the majority of the people. And so, when these infrastructures buckle under pressure, then everybody is shocked and surprised. And actually, they were not made for such pressure. So the states are across the continent really do need to start looking at what are the needs of the people and start delivering on those. And I don't think that that's happening yet. I think we're still seeing this big man politics going on, where all they're worried about is staying in power, and they really are not too worried about what happens to the people.
I suppose there are some issues that are always there, and I'm wondering, I'm hoping that we've seen an improvement. Things like violence against women and children. Is that sadly something that continues? But what is the trend? Is it increasing, or where are we?
Sadly, Peter, it is increasing. And in fact, during 2021 and during COVID, it increased considerably. And, there's a lot of reasons that have been given to this. I mean, one of them is that, people were at home, they were cooped up at home. And so domestic violence increased quite significantly during this time. But actually, it really has been across the board. We've seen sexual violence, we've seen rape increase. We've seen femicide, as I said, there's been an increase across the continent. We've seen women we saw what happened in Ethiopia. So, it just continues. And, these are getting worse. And our governments are doing nothing. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of rhetoric. We saw in South Africa, the president came out, no use if perpetrators are not being brought to the book. And DNA,
Shenilla, it sounds like your connection is imploding there. So we're going to leave it there. But this report is available online, I guess, if people want to have a look at it. So they can get onto your website and download it.
Absolutely. If you get onto www.amnesty.org, information.
All right. Shenilla, thank you so much indeed. Always good talking to you. I wish you had better news, but it's good to point these things out. So that's the first step in fixing them. So thanks so much indeed for that.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, okay. I had to cut that a little shorter than planned. The signal starting to play havoc there. But disturbing report by Amnesty International about the state of human rights in 2021, 2022. And at the top, sadly, abuses during a pandemic.